This video is going to show you how to set your bump stops when doing your Tahoverlanding solid axle conversion. Your bump stops will be the very last thing you do on your build. You will have done everything else before you finalize the bump stops. Obviously, if you watch the videos, you'll see that what you'll do before this is you will have cycled the axle up and down a few times throughout the build just to get a rough idea of where the bump stop is probably going to land, because you will need to find out how far the axle can tuck as far as setting your radius arm length and things. You will not finalize the bump stops themselves until the very end. This video is going to show you how to do that.
And this is something that's extremely important. Now, it doesn't seem as important to some people, but not only having bump stops, but proper placement of bump stops is extremely crucial. I had two customers that didn't have their bump stops placed correctly, and one took 3 years and one took about 1.5 years, and both did experience some damage from long-term fatigue of parts because there was metal on metal contacting instead of the bump stop taking the actual impact every time they bottom out their suspension, which happens a lot more than you think. Even just driving normally, you actually will contact bump stops more than you think.
Now we're going to lower it down onto the axle as far as we can, get the axle as close as we can, and still allow everything to cycle, and then we'll stop right when the first thing to contact just barely starts contacting. Things to check for when you're tucking the axle as far up as you can is going to be the axle itself coming into contact with the frame, the radius arms themselves coming into contact with the frame, but the more likely things that will probably come into contact with the frame first will be the drag link coming in contact with either the frame itself on the passenger side, or even just your tie rods. As you tuck so tight, your tie rods might start interfering with each other because everything is tucked so tight, because our kit will allow you to tuck so tight upward. You will also want to double check your track bar, make sure the track bar is not going to contact the oil pan or the differential itself. You should have been checking that when you were actually, building the track bar. Even then, the track bar still may be the first thing, depending on how much clearance you have upwards. So another thing to take into consideration, in this video, we are not doing this because the customer hasn't chosen shocks yet, but you want to make sure that your shock absorbers don't bottom out before your bump stops engage, because you will blow shocks if your bump stops aren't what bottoms out before the shocks. Just look wherever it's going to contact first. Sometimes it's something you can just trim or grind in clearance and get a little bit more. And sometimes it's something major where small clearancing efforts aren't going to make a difference. Or even the exhaust. Since our kit works so well with the gas engine trucks, it's not like other kits that really only work with Duramax trucks that don't have exhaust on the driver's side. You may want to look at the exhaust and see if there's anything you can do to adjust the exhaust routing to get more upward suspension travel to maybe clear the drive shaft. Sometimes that's an issue depending on what year and model of truck you have. Why you have to measure and cycle for this is because everybody's build is different. Different ride heights result in different track bar lengths, which means how far the axle traverses side to side as the suspension cycles is going to be different on every single build. And different choices like how far forward you choose to set the axle, all kinds of things are going to make a lot of difference in the bump stops, because a 1/4 inch makes a difference when it comes to bump stops. So you need to actually cycle your suspension and set your bump stops yourself and not go off of someone else's measurement.
So what you're going to do next is, with it fully tucked, take and measure between the part of the axle that's going to contact the frame and the frame. And then the bump stops I'm using, we know the spec is they compressed 5/8 of an inch at full compression. I always add an extra 1/8 of an inch just in case for maybe some really large hits, or if the bump stop wears out a little bit. So you can see we're measuring between here and here on the passenger side. And over here, driver's side's a lot harder to see because of all the brackets in the way. It's also worth noting why the Tahoverlanding track bar bracket is shaped the way that it is. At full compression, it clears the differential housing only just barely. If that bracket came even a little more this way, it gets into the diff cover and the bolts. So everything clears. So close, but everything clears. I had two customers over the years. One who went 3 years after doing his build, but didn't have his bump stops properly set as far as height goes. And one that went about 1.5 years, where his bump stops weren't even contacting the axle at all. They did have some damage from stress and failure of metal on metal contact on every time they hit a bump, because you do bottom out your suspension a lot more than you think when you're actually just normally driving too. So this is important. This is how I like to do bump stops. As you can see, the bump stops that we use have a little stud coming out the back of them. So I take kind of a thick washer that I cut, CNC cut on the plasma table, and weld a nut to it. Get the nut nice and square in relation to it. I actually cut it so the nut presses in, and I'll weld the nut, and then this gets welded to a piece of tube that'll weld to the frame. I'm just using some scrap tubing that I have, but I intentionally am using tubing that's a hair smaller in diameter, so then I can just do a really easy weld right there. Makes it even easier to weld. Just an angled cut to kind of match the slope of the frame. It'll work a lot better if you do that. It doesn't have to be exactly perfect. Your weld can make up a lot, but this at least gets it in the ballpark. Let's see. So the goal is to have it actually be straight, so it's pushing straight up into the frame instead of getting pushed like this. We got the center line for the bump stop marked. We get that bump stop mount kind of tack welded under there, and we can get it all welded. Yeah.
Centered in the frame rail?
If we can center it as close as we can. And then we'll just tack it and we'll unthread that little dealy bobber. Just want to make sure it's kind of square and level, you know. So then I gotta go to the other side. The ABS and all that stuff. On it. Oh man, I posted a gravel or clearance front after this.
Boom. Okay. Bump stop's installed. You'll note that the bump stop is on this plane that the axle's going to contact it instead of on the slope of the frame, so it's not being bent as it's contacted. Your kit to solid axle swap your full-size Chevy, just like we showed how to put bump stops on one today, at Tahoverlanding.com.